Buenos días, bienvenidos a todos al Museo del Prado para esas jornadas que dedicamos a Rafael. Yo soy Gabriele Finaldi, el director adjunto de conservación del museo. Sentado a mi lado está Miguel Falomir, jefe de departamento de la pintura renacentista del museo y además cocomisario de esta exposición. La verdad es que la exposición Rafael nos ha dado una grandísima satisfacción. Cuando concebimos la idea de hacer la exposición sobre Rafael, nos dimos cuenta que nuestro museo no se suele considerar como una de las sedes de la importante presencia de Rafael. Todo el mundo conoce pues, las colecciones del Greco, de Velázquez, de Goya, de Tiziano, pero Rafael, decimos, no está en el radar de muchos de los visitantes del museo, siendo esta una colección absolutamente fundamental. Lo que tenía mucho sentido, naturalmente, era juntarnos con la otra institución que tiene una representación extraordinaria del último Rafael, que es el Louvre, y de esta forma, pues juntando las dos colecciones, pues teníamos ya el núcleo de una exposición que podía ser realmente muy interesante y muy importante. Luego decidimos contar con el comisariado de dos personas muy expertas en Rafael que nos acompañan hoy, que son Tom Henry y Paul Joannidis, y creo que los resultados de todo este esfuerzo, esta colaboración con el Louvre y con los comisarios científicos, pues la verdad es motivo para nosotros de gran satisfacción, y para todos los que ya habéis visto la exposición, me imagino que habéis encontrado bastantes cosas de interés. Naturalmente es un periodo de preparación largo lo que nos ha llevado a este momento, no solamente de planteamiento de la exposición, de negociación de los préstamos que forman parte de cualquier proyecto expositivo, sino también ha habido un camino bastante importante en cuanto a la preparación científica de la exposición con varias reuniones de técnicos y de especialistas, tanto en Madrid como en París, que creo que también pues, nos han permitido avanzar en el conocimiento de esta última fase de la actividad del pintor y de su taller. Y nos faltaba pues, la última reunión, que naturalmente nunca será la última, sino el inicio de, espero, nuevas avenidas de investigación, pues que era precisamente la de hoy, donde montada la exposición, expuesto, decimos, la tesis de la exposición en el catálogo, pues se reunían los especialistas para examinar, para debatir, para dialogar sobre la exposición, sobre sus contenidos, sobre sus ideas, y espero que serán días fructíferos. Quiero dar las gracias a todos los que han venido, todos los profesores que han venido a dar sus ponencias. Estamos muy agradecidos, además, como nos hemos pagado, estamos doblemente agradecidos. Quiero dar las gracias también a aquellos representantes de instituciones que han prestado obras a la exposición, porque sin obras no hay exposición. Quiero darle un agradecimiento especial al superintendente Luigi Ficacci de Bologna, que nos acompaña también hoy en este día. Como sabéis, no solamente ha prestado quizás el cuadro más bello de toda la exposición, que es la Santa Cecilia, sino lo ha prestado en circunstancias particularmente difíciles para lo que son sus responsabilidades como superintendente en Emilia-Romagna en este tiempo de los terremotos, cuando las preocupaciones van bastante más allá de si prestar o no prestar una obra de arte a una exposición. Por tanto, doblemente gracias al profesor Ficacci, y estamos encantados que nos acompañe hoy en esta jornada. Voy a ceder la palabra a Miguel Falomir, comisario de la exposición y jefe de departamento del museo, y también organizador, director de estas jornadas, y a mostrarle también mi aprecio por todo el trabajo que ha hecho para este proyecto, que sin sus conocimientos y su entusiasmo pues no se habría llevado a realizar. Muchas gracias. A Miguel Falomir la palabra.
Bueno, buenos días a todos y antes que nada muchas gracias por asistir. La verdad es que no esperábamos un éxito en términos de público como el que está teniendo la exposición, que en 2 semanas lleva ya 50.000 visitantes, y tampoco pensábamos que pues un congreso tan especializado como este iba a suscitar pues tanto interés. La verdad es que es mucha la gente que se ha apuntado y gente que viene desde latitudes tan lejanas como Australia o Corea, a los cuales pues quiero darles las gracias especialmente. El Departamento de Pintura Italiana del Renacimiento ha intentado siempre que las exposiciones sean algo más que simplemente una exposición y desde luego mucho más que una reunión de obras maestras. Y en la medida de lo posible pues siempre ha intentado acompañarlo no solamente de un catálogo, sino también de una serie de actividades que de alguna manera completen la visión sobre un pintor o sobre un momento determinado de la historia del arte. Así se hizo con Tintoretto y así se ha hecho o se está haciendo con Rafael. Cuando se pensó en hacer esta exposición, lo primero que se pensó era en contar con la colaboración del Museo del Louvre. Ni el Museo del Louvre ni el Museo del Prado contaba con especialistas en Rafael y esa fue la razón por la cual se recurrió a 2 comisarios externos, a los profesores Tom Henry y Paul Ioannidis, que son los comisarios de la exposición. Es una exposición en cierta medida muy personal. Todo el mundo, todos los que estamos aquí, probablemente cada uno tiene una opinión particular sobre cada uno de los cuadros que hay en la exposición. Eso hizo que buscáramos deliberadamente una exposición y un catálogo de autor, es decir, los autores han asumido la responsabilidad de sus opiniones y es la razón por la cual, a excepción de 2 textos que hay en el catálogo de carácter técnico, pues todos los textos, todas las fichas han sido escritas conjuntamente por los 2 comisarios de la exposición. Como somos plenamente conscientes de que no hay una opinión, sino hay muchas otras, pues es una de las razones por las cuales estamos hoy reunidos aquí. En ese sentido quiero decir que, bueno, esta mañana hemos tenido ocasión de ver la exposición a museo cerrado, mañana volveremos a tener ocasión de ver la exposición a museo cerrado desde las 9 hasta las 10. Y los comisarios de la exposición, los profesores Tom Henry y Paul Ioannidis, pues están dispuestos a discutir delante de algunos de los cuadros pues lo que son sus opiniones y contrastarlas con las de los asistentes al Congreso. Con lo cual, pues mañana, independientemente de que quien quiera seguir viendo la exposición por su cuenta, pues que sepa también que los comisarios sí que se centrarán en algunas obras, probablemente en aquellas que pueden ser más problemáticas, para discutir con los participantes sobre ello. A efectos prácticos, solamente decir que hay un sistema de traducción simultánea, es decir, está a vuestra disposición para el que no hable inglés o hable español. Y luego, aparte de eso, señalar que en las carpetas se os han proporcionado los currículums de todos los asistentes, de tal forma que no vamos a hacer una introducción de cada uno de ellos, una presentación de cada uno de ellos, y que a fin de que sea mucho más fluido la sesión, pues pasaremos de uno a otro. Como recordaros que tenéis los currículums en las carpetas y que después de cada sesión, es decir, hoy antes de comer, esta tarde a última hora y mañana igual, pues habrá turnos de preguntas donde pues los conferenciantes pues estarán gustosos de responder las dudas que se planteen. Y eso es todo por mi parte. Gracias.
Bien, pues me toca a mí dirigir la primera sesión de esta mañana, que vamos a dedicar a Rafael. Ya las siguientes se centrarán en las actividades del taller y las figuras que rodean a Rafael en esa última fase de su actividad. Como acabamos de decir, vamos a escuchar las ponencias y al final de la sesión, que será justo antes de comer, pues reuniremos a todos los ponentes aquí y se podrán hacer preguntas. Por tanto, ir pensando en las preguntas que queréis hacer y no os olvidéis, cuando llegamos a la última, pues las preguntas que queríais hacer al primer ponente. Recordamos, si alguien necesita traducción, los aparatos están ahí arriba, se pueden recoger. Si alguien se ha olvidado de recogerlo, lo puede recoger ahora o a lo largo de la mañana. Da la casualidad que todas las conferencias de esta mañana, todas las ponencias, se van a dar en inglés. Pues la sesión de mañana, como decía, se centra en la persona y la actividad específica de Rafael. Como hemos dicho, no vamos a introducir individualmente los currículums de cada uno de los ponentes y vamos a empezar, por tanto, esta mañana, antes de tomar café, con el profesor Paul Barolsky, que hablará sobre The Elusive Raphael, y a continuación la doctora Cheryl Rice, que hablará sobre Raphael, Pope Leo X, and Cardinal Giulio de Medici. So please, Professor Barolsky, if you'd come to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Joannides, Tom Henry, and everybody else for being here today. Who was Raphael? What was he really like? I'm not the first person to ask these questions. They remain good questions because the great painter is elusive. Our sense of Raphael is ever so different from our understanding of his contemporaries, Leonardo and Michelangelo. With Leonardo, we have a vast corpus of writings that give us a sense of the man, of his probing intellect, and even his moods. With Michelangelo, we have a substantial body of letters which are filled with wit and ill humor, with many shifts of sensibility from rage to jest. We also have a large corpus of his poetry, which is deep in its emotional intensity. In the case of Raphael, however, although we have a vast body of documentation pertaining to the artist, these documents, mostly related to contracts and such, give us little insight into the inner man. There are a few letters and a few unprepossessing poems attributed to Raphael, but they reveal essentially nothing. The art of Raphael is, of course, majestic and deep, but we do not find the mind of the man or the emotions of the man apart from his art, apart from either his drawings or his finished work. The inner Raphael escapes us. There is nothing in Raphael's words that hint at the majesty of his art. Even in his self-portraits, he escapes us. Consider, for example, Raphael's well-known self-portrait with a friend, the majestic picture from Paris, which shows the painter ever so impassive and remote as he gazes upon us with implacable aloofness. There has been a vast amount of unresolved speculation as to the identity of Raphael's companion in this portrait, and I will not add to it here. This double portrait was painted sometime in Raphael's final years when, approximately 35 years old, the artist was at the heights of his powers, just a few years before his untimely death, at a moment when he was enjoying a huge success in Rome. In his magisterial bearing, the Raphael of this self-portrait evokes the sense Vasari gives us of a princely personage. In reality, Raphael must have been a consummate courtier serving both Popes Julius II and Leo X with great tact, ambition, and skill. The calm aloofness of the portrait conceals the intense drive of a man who managed to climb to the pinnacle of the highly competitive art world of papal Rome in the early 16th century as painter, architect, and archaeologist. To think about Raphael is to consider an artist as remote from us as are the subjects of the portraits of Piero della Francesca, whose art is bound up with the court of Urbino, the native city of Raphael. even though he is capable of realizing great drama in his art, for example, in his Vatican frescoes and tapestry designs, our sense of the man behind the work is that of an individual who is highly impersonal, as we have observed in the Louvre self-portrait, in which Raphael appears as if wearing a mask. To think about who Raphael is thus to seek the man behind the mask in the Paris picture. It is to consider and contemplate a highly distilled aesthetic ideal which is linked to the art of Piero della Francesca, an ideal vividly articulated in words in the influential modern criticism of Bernard Berenson. More than any other writer of his day in the late 19th century, Berenson brought Piero to the fore in his highly influential writing. Indeed, Berenson put Piero on the critical map. Virtually all of the modern criticism of the painter descends from Berenson. I am attending to it here because I think it addresses our sense of Raphael as well. When Berenson, celebrating Piero's impersonality, sees the absence of expressed emotion as a quality of things in the work of Piero, when Berenson speaks of the impassive Piero in whose work all specific emotion is disregarded, he could also be speaking of Raphael's Louvre self-portrait with a friend. He could also be speaking of several other court portraits in the Uffizi which have been attributed to the artist. The portrait of the Duchess of Urbino, Elisabetta Gonzaga. The portrait of Guidobaldo, the Duke of Urbino. And the portrait of Francesco Maria della Rovere, prefect and eventual Duke of Urbino. Both the attributions and the identities of the sitters of these pictures are open to question and have been much debated over time. All three pictures are in the tradition of Piero della Francesca, who contributed so much to the culture of the court of Urbino, which in turn seemingly shaped the aesthetics of the young Raphael as well. The impassive countenances of these pictures foreshadow the cool and aloof bearing of the courtly Raphael in the full maturity of the Louvre self-portrait. Although we have no frontal portraits by Piero della Francesca, I show you here from the Resurrection of Jesus, the painter's iconic portrayal of Jesus, who is both hauntingly imminent and remote at the same time, side by side with Raphael's self-image. I do this because Raphael's self-portrayal in the Louvre picture, as it has sometimes been suggested, is typologically related to the way in which the painter imagined Jesus. Yes, there are significant differences between these images, but there is something suggestive about Raphael's almost iconic self-image in relation to the typology of the heavy-lidded Jesus of Piero. Long after Raphael, but not long before Berenson rediscovered Piero, Goethe captured the impersonal effect of which I speak. Discussing the figures in ancient art in the wake of Winckelmann, he says that they represented existences, whereas we moderns represent the effect. This ideal articulated by Goethe, which I find in Raphael's Louvre self-portrait, was also given voice by Burckhardt, who, speaking of Bellini, remarked upon emotionless figures in a blessed state of being. This ideal was also widely diffused in the 19th century, and William Hazlitt repeated it when he observed of the figures in Greek art that it seems enough for them to be without acting or suffering. Such evocations of an aesthetic of impersonality lead us to the classic modern formulation of a theory of impersonality relevant to our appreciation of Raphael, and specifically his Louvre self-portrait. I speak of the writings of T.S. Eliot, following the lead of Walter Pater, and I suspect of Bernard Berenson himself. Eliot formulated the ideal of impersonality most famously in his essay of 1919, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Here is what Eliot said, and I quote, "For my meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality." What Eliot observed, speaking in general of the poet, is especially true of the painters Piero della Francesca and Raphael. Eliot famously remarked that the present influences the past, and so what we might say here is that the modern theory of the impersonal shapes or influences the way we see Raphael, specifically the Raphael of the Louvre self-portrait with a friend. In other words, we see Raphael through the lens of Eliot and the tradition to which he belongs, which includes not only Berenson and Pater, but also Immanuel Kant, whose notion of disinterestedness has everything to do with impersonality. When Walter Pater spoke of Raphael as an impassive and impersonal painter, he likened the artist's impersonal work to architecture, a highly suggestive clue to our understanding of Raphael, as we will presently see. If we read Vasari's full-scale biography of Raphael, composed a quarter century after the artist's death from a variety of sources, what emerges is an image of courtly grace and refinement, the mask or persona of an individual whose personality is hidden or concealed from us, as it is in his Louvre self-portrait with a friend. When emotional intensity emerges in the biography of Raphael, it informs the descriptions of Raphael's art, not his life story. We read in Vasari of Raphael's love life, but we are given no clues to the painter's specific passions. In short, Raphael is remote. We know who Raphael's friends were: Pietro Bembo, poet and historian; Cardinal Bibbiena, comic playwright, portrayed by Raphael here; and above all, Baldassare Castiglione, whose portrait by Raphael embodies the ideal of courtly grace, the sprezzatura of which he wrote in the Book of the Courtier. We also know other important personages with whom Raphael was associated. For example, Tommaso Inghirami, the papal librarian. In Raphael's portrait of Inghirami, the sitter gazes heavenward. Here, as often pointed out, Raphael takes a defect, Inghirami was wall-eyed, and transforms it into something positive by showing him in an upward gaze, as if he were seeking heavenly inspiration. The shrewd transformation of a defect into virtue is the manifestation of pictorial wit, if not sprezzatura. Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, of which I have just spoken, is a handbook of impersonality. All of the book's subjects, in a sense, wear masks. Castiglione's book also offers us clues as to how Julius II might have come to commission the project of the Segnatura decorations, which include the School of Athens, the papal library. Castiglione tells us that after Pope Julius II's military campaigns in Bologna, he stopped briefly in Urbino. Here he would have seen the decoration of the studiolo, which combined portraits of such luminaries as Homer, Euclid, and Dante, among other other luminaries, and tarsia decorations as well. One cannot but wonder whether the memory of this splendid decoration informs, at least in part, the Pope's ambition to have tarsia work and images of great personages adorning his library in the Vatican. One of the prominent personages portrayed in Urbino, Dante, also provides a clue to the scheme of the Segnatura decoration. Present in both the fresco of theology since Dante was a theologian, and present upon the adjacent fresco of Parnassus, since he was a poet, Dante had described a great assemblage of illustrious personages, including poets and philosophers, in the limbo of his Inferno. Scholars have speculated, but not recently, that the general scheme for the papal library has at least partial roots in Dante's celebration of great poets and philosophers, among other luminaries. I would suggest that the taproots of the Segnatura are to be located in the Pope's memory of Urbino and Dante's poem. Raphael's decoration, no matter who devised its exact subject, is no less the pictorial analog of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, in its celebration of great authors and its ideals of cultural harmony. As I have emphasized, the inner world of Raphael in some fundamental way eludes us. When he became superintendent of antiquities under Pope Leo X, he wrote a famous report, or rather Castiglione penned the report, or so many scholars believe. In other words, Raphael's ideas were delivered to the Pope in the language of the more bookish Castiglione. To put it differently, Raphael employed Castiglione to shape his own persona. Castiglione took this identification a step further when, in a well-known letter concerning Raphael's fresco of Galatea, seemingly written by Raphael, he wrote in the voice of Raphael. In other words, assuming the persona of Raphael, Castiglione addressed the letter to himself. He did so with delicious irony, since he pretended to be the recipient of the letter that he himself conceived and composed. In a witty literary conceit, Castiglione was an impersonator playing the role of his friend Raphael. Such impersonation is also consistent with a poem that Castiglione wrote in the voice of his wife, who addresses the portrait of Castiglione that Raphael had painted of him. Here, too, we are dealing with an art of personae, or masks, an art of impersonality in which Castiglione assumes the persona of his wife, who speaks to his own image in the portrait. Just as he adapts the persona of his friend Raphael in the Galatea letter, he takes on the persona of his wife, who speaks to the painting in his poem about his portrait of Raphael. We easily accede to the verisimilitude of such fictions, even though our eventual consciousness of such ingeniously artful trickery almost induces vertigo. In the letter concerning the Galatea, supposedly to Castiglione, but in fact written by Castiglione, Raphael, or rather Castiglione's fictive Raphael, says that he was working from a conception or invenzione for the fresco of Galatea furnished to him by Castiglione. Is there some truth to Castiglione's fictional letter? What exactly might Castiglione have furnished Raphael in the way of an idea? A citation from Ovid? More than this? In the letter, Castiglione's fictional Raphael amusingly imagines himself with Castiglione as they both judge the beauty of various beautiful women in an effort to achieve the ideal beauty to be realized in the image of Galatea. Here we have the implicit artful story of collaboration and friendship of the painter and the author. To put the point differently, the letter is a witty double portrait of the painter with his literary friend. We are reminded of such portraits of friendship, including the Louvre double portrait, but also Raphael's portrait of the writers Navaggero and Beazzano. Castiglione's fictional Raphael says famously in the letter that he has una certa idea of Galatea's beauty, a phrase that has decidedly a Neoplatonic ring to it. But given the sensuousness of the image of Galatea, the Neoplatonic illusion has been properly described as tongue-in-cheek. The voluptuous Galatea, painted by Raphael, has scarcely anything of the Neoplatonic about her. On the contrary, no less significant than the reference to Galatea in the make-believe Raphael letter is the allusion to architecture, specifically the building of St. Peter's, over which Raphael presided after the death of another of his friends, Bramante. Aspiring to the beautiful forms of ancient buildings, the fictional Raphael of Castiglione's letter says, in the language of Ovid, that he hopes his flight will not be like that of Icarus. Perhaps, therefore, he implies his association with the father of Icarus, Daedalus, the great mythic architect who is the ancestor of all great architects. Was this allusion inspired in part by the presence of Sebastiano del Piombo's fresco of Daedalus and Icarus in a lunette above Raphael's Galatea? Before he became an architect, Raphael had painted architecture of extraordinary monumentality, nowhere with more grandeur than in the School of Athens, in the papal library, which has often been linked to the work of his friend Bramante. It is here in this fresco that everything I have been talking about today comes together. Raphael's impersonality and his artful cunning. In a work that has more gravity than we find in Castiglione's letter in the voice of Raphael, the painter aspires most emphatically to a Neoplatonic idea. I speak of a detail that is otherwise ignored. Let me explain. I begin by calling your attention to the figures of Plato and Aristotle at the center of the composition. The harmony of their forms evokes the Renaissance ideal of reconciling the two major philosophical systems of Platonism and Aristotelianism, the Concordia Platonis et Aristoteles, as it was called. Whereas Aristotle, holding a copy of his Ethics, which deal with moral philosophy and, broadly speaking, social and human relations, gestures appropriately toward the ground, that is, this world, Plato, holding the Timaeus, a fundamental book concerning the heavenly bodies, gestures heavenward. The unity of the fresco can be defined as the point at which the gazes of the two philosophers intersect as they look into each other's eyes. The perspective construction of the fresco reinforces this central meaning as it draws us to the two philosophers at center stage, at the center of the image. But if we look upward, following the indication of Plato's gesture, that is, his heavenward pointing finger, we see a partially revealed drum of a dome, the rest of which is mostly concealed by a great central barrel vault of the fresco. In the drum, we see two columns beyond which the blue sky with a puff of clouds is visible. These neglected but by no means arbitrary columns correspond ever so neatly to the two figures below, and I suspect in a most meaningful way. Indeed, when we follow the indication of Plato, we see a similitude between the bodies of the two philosophers and the two columns. This is a significant similarity since, according to a deep and conventional idea, the architectural column corresponds to the vertebral column, or columna vertebralis, that houses the spinal cord. Raphael's two columns rest on bases or pedestals which are the feet of the columns, the piedestali from piedi, which are derived from the Latin pia for foot. At the top of the columns, concealed from us, we can imagine capitals or capitelli from caput, which means head. From foot to head, Raphael's columns correspond abstractly to the human body. Whereas Michelangelo's architecture is fascinating because the architect seeks to invest the classical order with the impressive vitality and muscular force of the human body, Raphael's columns are more distilled as abstracted ideas of the human body. What I think Raphael was doing here in this image of two columns to which Plato points was render or make visible a fundamentally Neoplatonic idea. In Raphael's art, the column is an abstraction of the human body, and such abstraction points to a higher reality beyond the bodily, beyond what we find in the physical world. In fact, Raphael suggests a higher reality inasmuch as we do not see the columns in their entirety. We are encouraged to imagine a realm beyond what we can see, a higher realm of transcendent reality, as we approach platonically pure form itself. Raphael's Invenzione, which suggests the Neoplatonic elevation of the mind to pure form, has never, I believe, been remarked upon. And I believe this is so because Raphael's abstract architecture is sui generis, and there is no comparable text to which the scholar of iconography can point in order to explain Raphael's conceit. But once one gives oneself up to Plato's gesture and its implications as we follow its indication heavenward, Raphael's meaning becomes clear. In the end, the drum of the School of Athens suggests a dome that rises high into the heavens beyond what we can see with our corporeal eyes. I think that in picturing the sky beyond the columns of the drum, Raphael is remembering and transforming the view one has as one gazes through the oculus of the Pantheon, a building that Raphael both loved and studied carefully, and to which he returned when buried with glorious praise. I realize this is merely a hunch on my part, an intuition that cannot be proven. Raphael's Neoplatonic image of two columns as abstractions of the human body suggests a reality beyond what we see. Raphael suggests an ascent from the two bodies of Plato and Aristotle to their abstract analogues, the two columns, and these abstract forms suggest a reality above and beyond. These columns suggest an elevation of the mind heavenward beyond what we can know in the physical world. Raphael's meaningful architectural detail of two columns corresponding abstractly to the human body and is also an analog of the Neoplatonic rhapsody in Castiglione's Book of the Courtier of Pietro Bembo. Here, Raphael's friend rises in vision beyond the corporeal world, higher and higher still toward platonically pure form. We know of Bembo's extensive learning, his erudition from his writings, just as we know a great deal of Castiglione's vast learning from his writings. We know the scope of Raphael's learning and intelligence, however, not from his writings, which are scant, but from his art. And what we know of Raphael's mind as embodied in art is that it is ingenious, deep, and highly original. We do not know exactly how Raphael came to his knowledge of things Platonic and how he transposed such learning from words into visual images, just as we do not know much about the inner world of Raphael's emotions or feelings. In short, the flesh and blood Raphael continues to elude us. Like the cool, self-contained persona of his self-portrait with an unidentified friend, he remains remote, highly impersonal, in many respects, beyond our reach. Gracias.